Today I'm going to talk about virtual switches in Home Assistant. I'm going to talk about what they are, where you might use them, and more importantly, how you create them. So hang around. Hi, and welcome to Resin Chem Tech. Now, if you're already using Home Assistant, odds are you already have a number of switches in your Home Assistant installation. A switch is a simple entity that has two states, off or on, and in your dashboard, it's nice because it shows you not only the current state, whether that switch is off or on, but also allows you to easily change the state by just sliding a simple slider or clicking a button. Now, lights are also switches, although they're a special kind of switch that sometimes have some additional properties or attributes, which we're going to take a look at, but for the purpose of this video, we'll consider switches in general, which will also include lights. But maybe you have some things in Home Assistant that you wish you could control like a switch and simply toggle off and on. So here are a few examples we're going to take a look at today. I just threw this dashboard together to give you a quick demo. Now note that I am using the custom button card for all of my virtual and actual switches here. But do note that this works exactly the same if you use the standard toggle switches or the entities card in Home Assistant. You don't have to use the custom button card. It just makes it a little bit easier to see here in the video. And if you are interested in the custom button card, I just recently did a video on how to use these custom button cards, and you can take a look at that after this video. So the examples we're going to look at today, first is going to take a normal physical switch, which in this case controls the lights, and we're going to set some virtual switches to select preset brightness levels for that light. Then we're going to take a look at a smart streaming box or a TV, which again is a normal switch to turn off and on, and we're going to add some virtual switches to show which service is currently playing and to easily switch between services. Then we'll take a look at a WLED display, which once again is a light entity with a single on and off switch, add some virtual switches to select both some colors and some effects. And then finally, if you hang around to the end, I'm going to show you an alternate method using some input Booleans to create some potentially fun automations, including one that might help you with your kids and making sure that they get their chores done. So we're going to start by taking a look again at that light switch and adding some preset brightness levels that we can treat like a switch that will easily show us the current brightness level selected and allow us to easily change from one to the other. So this is how we're going to create those virtual or templated switches in Home Assistant. First, if we take a look at the states under the developer tools of this particular light entity, we can see that it has a state, in this case is on, and that's what you would normally get whenever you integrate this particular light. Now this light is dimmable, and since it's dimmable, it happens to have an attribute called brightness, and it's this brightness attribute that we're going to use to create our switches. Now to create our templated switch, it does at this point in time require that you write a little bit of YAML, but don't panic. This is pretty easy, and there are parts of this that you could create with the Home Assistant UI, but as of right now, to create a templated switch, that you do have to write YAML. So wherever you have your switch integration defined, this is this top switch, that might be your configuration.yaml, it might be in a switches.yaml file, or it might even be in packages if you're using those. We're going to add a platform of template. And then we're going to say switches, and underneath that we're going to define our template switches. Now there are three main parts to this, and the first part is the value template. We're going to use a template, and don't worry, it's not going to be hard to write, that always evaluates either true or false. When it's true, the switch will be turned on. When it's false, the switch will be turned off. Then there are a couple of other parts. There's going to be what do we want to do or what actions do we want to take when we turn that switch on. So when we toggle it from off to on, what services or scripts do we want to run? And in the same way, when we turn that switch back off, what services or scripts do we want to run? Now for the template for these lights, we're going to be using a simple function called isStateAttribute or isStateAttr. What this is going to do is going to look at an attribute of an entity and see if it's equal to a given value. And if it is, then it's going to return true and the switch will be on. If it's not matched to that value, the switch will be off. So if we take a look again at our entity itself, and we see we've got that brightness attribute. So our value template is going to look like this. So we can see that this is our entity ID, is light.basement. we want to take a look at the brightness attribute. And in the case of our 100% switch, we want that value to be 255. So whenever the value is 255, then this switch, this 100% switch, will be turned on. Anytime the value is anything other than 255, the switch will be turned off. So from there, it's very easy to do the same thing for each of our other switches. All we have to do is change that brightness value in our value template. So that takes care of the switches being off or on, but now we need to define those actions, or what happens when we actually click that switch to toggle it from off to on and from on to off. Well, here's a simple process for what happens when we turn on that switch. Again, there you see the value template. Whenever it's 255, the switch will be on. But then for our turn on action, we're simply just going to call a service to turn that light on. And as part of the data of that, we're going to say set the brightness to 255. Now, again, if you're really not comfortable with YAML, do note that you can create this as a script instead, and you can use the automation UI to do that. So these two things, the YAML and what you're seeing in the automation UI, are identical. They're both turning on the light and setting a brightness to 255. So now if you actually do want to create your script using the automation.ui, all you have to do back in your definition of your switch in YAML is just turn on that script and call the name of the script. And our turn off is basically exactly the same. We just say what scripts we want to run. In this case, light.turnoff, and turn off the basement lights. And once again, you can create that in the automation UI if you want, or the script UI editor, and simply just call that script. So here is the full example of everything all put together. Again, you'll see for my lights 100, I changed the name here instead of 255. Lights 100%. My value template says that switch is on whenever the value of the attribute of brightness is 255 for this entity. Here's what I want to do when that switch turns on. Here's what I want to do when that switch turns off. Now, I'm not going to use a turn off for my switches, and I'll show you why here in just a second, but I am going to have the turn on. And then I just simply repeat this for each of the other switches that I have here. So lights 75, lights 50, all I have to do is change the name of the switch itself and change the value of this attribute that I'm watching for. Okay, so here we are again. You see here at the top is my physical light switch that simply turns the lights off and on, but here are my virtual switches. Right now, the attribute value for brightness is set to 255. If I simply click this down to 75%, you'll see that the attribute value has now been changed. Since it's no longer 255, this switch is off and the 75% switch is on. And again, I repeat that for 20 and 25. Now, if you recall, I mentioned that I did not use a turn off function. So if I click this switch, you can see that I'm actually clicking it. It's not actually turning off because I'm not running anything. The reason I do that is if I turned it off and turned it back on, every time I switched brightnesses, the lights would actually flicker off and flicker back on again. So I'm not using an actual turn off for any of these virtual switches. If I want to turn the lights off, instead of clicking this, I actually click the main switch up here. And once again, just as a reminder, even though I'm using the custom button card, this works exactly the same way with the standard switches. Notice as I change the brightness, it turns the switches off and on. And again, if I want to use the main switch to turn the lights completely off, I turn it off there, and it also turns off all of my switches. And note, you can use the wall switch just like normal, and if you select one of those brightness levels, the switch will turn on. If you happen to select a value of brightness that isn't one of your switches, well, all the switches will be off, but the main light switch still shows that it's on. Okay, so now let's move on to the second example of where we're going to use switches to control the services that are actually going to run on our streaming box. And so again, you can see here as we switch, turn on the switches off and on, we're actually going to switch services that are running on our streaming box. So this example is going to be very similar to what we just did with brightness levels on a light. In this case, again, we have our normal on-off switch entity. In this case, for me, it happens to be a Roku device. But we're going to create these virtual switches that, again, are going to turn off or on to show us which service is actually running on our streaming box and allow us to easily switch those with a click of a button or the toggling of a slider. And just like we did with the brightness for our light, we're going to use the attributes of this main entity to create our virtual switches. So if we take a look at this entity, I actually have two examples of the same entity here. This is my media player Roku Ultra. Here's my state of that, off or on, just like a normal switch. If we take a look over here at the attributes, we'll see app name and source. This is always going to tell us what app or what source is running on that streaming box. In my case, these are always the same, so they're interchangeable. So I'm just going to use source, but I could use app name as well. So for this first one, where the source is Prime Video, again, my entity ID is going to be my media player, Roku Ultra. My attribute is going to be source, and my value is going to be Prime Video. So I can create my value template just like I did with brightness, but this time, here's our entity, here's the attribute, and here's the value we want when this switch is to be on. Down here is the same thing, but the source is Netflix. So I can create the same kind of value template, but just change the value of the attribute of the source attribute to Netflix. Whenever the source is Netflix, this switch will be on, all of my other switches will be turned off. So just like our switches for brightness, we can come in here and define our templated switches for which service is running on the Roku. Again, here at the top is the Prime Video. Here is the Netflix. I would just create additional switches for each of the services I want to have a switch for. And once again, we now have to define the turn on and the turn off service to run. And so this is what it looks like in my case. Whenever I click the button, say for Prime Video, I want to turn on the Roku if it's not already on, and then I'm actually going to select a source, and I'm going to select the source of Prime Video, and that will actually cause Prime Video to run on the Roku. And in a similar manner, when I actually click that to turn it off, I'm actually going to turn off the Roku, which powers everything down. Now again, instead of calling these individual services here and turn on, turn off, if I wanted to, I could use the UI editor and actually create scripts and use my turn on and turn off to actually run those scripts. Now I do want to mention that we're just using this simple function of isState attribute in our template. Templates are extremely powerful and you can do a lot, including if-then statements, but passing in variables, all sorts of stuff. We're just going to use a simple one here, but if you want to know more about templates and how to use them in Home Assistant, Jeff over at Slacker Labs just recently did a really good video on using templates in Home Assistant. And so if you want to know more, I'll leave a link to his video down in the video description. So let's take a look at this one as well. It works much the same as the lights. If I click a service and the TV is off, part of my turn on script is going to first turn on this TV, then it's actually going to launch the particular service. In this case, it's going to launch Amazon Prime. If I go over here and I click the YouTube TV button, notice it's automatically going to switch the TV over to YouTube. Now, if you'll notice as I switch these services, sometimes there's a slight delay in terms of the switch turning itself on. The service launches right away, but it does take a second sometimes for Roku to report back the current app that it's running. It's really kind of that load time. So when you click the switch, it does run right away, but you'll notice there's a little bit of delay in terms of that switch lighting up. Now in my case, I'm also not using the turn off script to turn the TV off like I did with the lights. However, if I do click one of these buttons, what I actually have it do is just go back to the Roku main page. In this next example, we're actually going to create virtual switches for a WLED display. Now we have our normal switch here that would turn our lights off and on just like normal. But what we also have is we have some virtual switches that will allow us to, in my case, I'm going to select some solid colors so I can select green, which will also turn on the display, or blue, or red. But then I also have some shortcuts to some particular effects. So again, by clicking the virtual switch, not only do I see what effect is running, I'm easily able to switch from one effect to the other. And just like the other examples, even if I change this outside of Home Assistant, so let me go back and just select a solid color here, notice that the display is updating. So even if I select something like one of the effects here that I have set up, notice that it is reflected here on the display as well. If I select something that's not one of my virtual switches, the LED display is still on, but none of my particular selections are currently active. So for this one, we are going to do something slightly different. We're going to try to use two attributes in our value template. So we'll start out by taking a look at the states again under our developer tools, and we see the state of this entity or our WLED display is on. But when we take a look over here at the attributes, there's a few things that are interesting that we might want to use. First off is brightness. So we could set up brightness switches, just like we did with the overhead lights in the basement. That's not what we're going to do here, but brightness is available if you wanted to set up brightness switches. What we're actually going to look at here is the RGB color and the effect. Now, I do want to make one note about the RGB color. When you look at WLED, it can have up to 3 color settings based on the particular effect that you have running. The RGB color here in the attributes of the entity in Home Assistant only refers to this first color, normally called either the primary or the foreground color. So remember that when you're going to use this RGB color, you're only talking about this first color and not these other two. But the other attribute we're going to use is the effect. Now, there is one other handy thing listed here in the attributes, and that's the entire effect list. That's all the effects that are available in your WLED install. This is just nice because you can double check the actual name of an effect, make sure whether it has spaces or no spaces, how it's capitalized, because we do need that to match exactly in our value template. So first, let's take a look at that top row of buttons. These buttons are meant to have the WLED display show up in a solid color, red, green, blue, or pink in this case. We know what our entity ID is. That's the light.nano leaves in my case. But the attributes, there are actually 2 of them. We want the RGB color and we want an effect of solid. So we can create each of these just like we did before with the entity ID, the attribute we want to take a look at, and in this case, red, or the effect of being solid. But how do we use both those in our value template? Well, it's very easy. We just simply combine them in our value template and put an AND between the 2 statements. So in this case, for this first red switch, the color has to be 25500, which is red, and the effect has to be solid. If the color is not red or the effect is not solid, then our red switch will be turned off. So it's only turned on when both of those conditions are true and they're combined with an AND statement. And of course, for the other colors, all we've got to simply do is replace out the color for green, blue, and pink. Yes, I know technically this last one is really magenta, not pink, but it looks pink on the display. And then just like all of our other virtual switches, we simply add our turn on and our turn off. In my case, again, I'm turning on the display and I'm passing 2 data effects. In this case, I'm saying an effect of solid and RGB color of 25500, which is red in this case, and my turn off switch to simply turn off the display. So it's pretty much the same, except we're able to combine 2 attributes in our value template to determine whether a switch is off or on. Now, if we look at the effects, it's really the same thing, except in this case, we're just dropping off the color setting. We're just using the effect attribute set to a certain value, in this case, chase. And again, the same thing with our turn on, turn off. In this case, I'm just setting an effect of chase when I turn those lights on, and I'm not setting a color. And just a reminder, you don't have to use the custom button card. You can use the standard Home Assistant Entities card, and these will work in exactly the same way to be able to control your colors or select a preset. It's just a different way of displaying on your dashboard. So there are really just some basic ways that you can create virtual switches. Now, there are a lot of different ways to do this, and as I mentioned, you can get very complex with those value templates and of course the types of scripts and services that you run with turn on and turn off. But there is another way, and I mentioned this at the beginning, to create a virtual switch. And you can do that using something called input booleans, or what are called toggle helpers in the UI. And the nice thing about these is we're going to be able to create these without using any YAML whatsoever. I'll show the YAML version, but you can do these completely through the UI and create some fun automations as well. So input booleans are not created through any kind of integration. We do have to create those manually. And again, we can do that either in YAML or we can do it through the UI under the helpers section. So input booleans are much like switches in terms that they have 2 states, off or on. So in my case, I'm creating 4 input booleans, or what are called toggles, toggle helpers in the UI, but I'm creating one for each of these 4 switches. To create those, I simply just give them a name. I can set an initial state here, at least in the YAML side, and what that means is what state do I want this input boolean to have anytime Home Assistant restarts. Or I can simply leave that out, and when Home Assistant restarts, the switch or the input boolean will have the same state as it did before the restart. Now, input booleans do not have a turn on, turn off section like we saw with our other virtual switches. Instead, we're going to use automations to handle the turn on and turn off. And once again, these can be done either in YAML or through the automation UI. So here's an example of my trash automation. I'm going to use a trigger of the time of day of 7 a.m. and check to see if that's Tuesday. So every Tuesday at 7 a.m., it's going to run the action to turn on this input Boolean. Now, as of right now, the only thing this automation is doing is actually turning on that input Boolean, so it's going to flash the little icon on my dashboard. I may want to do other steps than that, and I could add additional services or actions here underneath the action part of the automation, but instead I'm going to create a separate automation that triggers off the fact that that input Boolean has changed. Now, why do I do a separate automation? Well, that means that I can click this button manually and my automation will fire, or it will fire automatically every Tuesday at 7 a.m. But in this particular automation, all I'm doing is I'm looking for the input Boolean to be changed from off to on, whether that's done through the other automation or whether I click the button manually. I'm not checking any conditions, but then I'm going to turn on a light and make an announcement. And just as an example of that, I found this online. This is not my project, but this would be an example of where you could turn on a light to indicate that it's trash day and to take out the trash. And I'm just making an announcement through my Google speaker saying it's time to take out the trash. You can do any kind of automation that you want, but you can key off of that input Boolean anytime it changes from off to on, run these steps or run these actions. Now, what about turning that input Boolean back off when the trash has been taken out? Well, of course, I could just come back in here and I could just simply click the icon to turn the input Boolean back off, or I could actually try to find a way to automate that. So you could have some kind of trigger, whether that be a motion sensor, distance sensor, some kind of door or window sensor on the lid of the trash can, whatever you can come up with to indicate that the trash has actually been taken out. We can trigger off of that and then call the action to simply turn that input Boolean back off again. And here's another simple example of it's time to walk the dog. In this case, I'm actually keying off of 3 different times of day. So at 7 a.m., noon, and at 6 p.m., it's going to turn this input Boolean on. And once again, I could go create an automation to take whatever actions I want, whether that just be a voice announcement, turn on a light, do whatever I want when this input Boolean turns from off to on. And again, I do that through a separate automation because that way it gives me the ability to have this trigger automatically at those 3 times of the day, or by simply coming up here and clicking the button myself, I can take whatever actions to say it's time to walk the dog. So I'll show you one final example here, just to give you some ideas of how you might use these in your own Home Assistant installation. Now, this final example I'm going to show does require the custom button card. Everything else I've shown here, you can use the standard toggles, but this requires a custom button card because I'm going to make use of a feature in here called lock. This actually allows me to lock this button whenever it's turned on, and it can only be clicked and turned off by certain users, in this case by mom or dad. So once this button is clicked, only mom or dad can click this button to turn it back off, and that's going to be important in our automation. So for our automation here, again, we're going to trigger off the fact that that input Boolean or that toggle helper is going from off to on. And once again, you could do all of this in the UI. I'm just showing the YAML here because it's a little bit easier to see and explain. But anytime that this input Boolean is toggled from off to on, so mom or dad clicks this button to say it's time to do the dishes, it's going to make an announcement over, in my case, all of my Google speakers saying it's time to do the dishes. Well, that might not be quite enough motivation to get your kids to actually come and say load the dishwasher. So we'll add a second action here. We're going to add a delay of 5 minutes. Now, that should technically be a timer, and when that timer expires, we could check the state again. But for simplicity, we're going to add a 5-minute delay, assume the kids haven't loaded the dishwasher. We're going to make an announcement again saying no TV until the dishes are done, and then we're actually going to turn off the TV. So you might be thinking, well, that's not going to work because the kids will just pick up the remote and turn the TV right back on. Well, we can run another automation and again use this input Boolean. So in this case, we're going to create an automation that anytime the TV is changed from off to on, it's going to check this input Boolean. If this input Boolean is still on, it's going to make another announcement saying no TV until the dishes are done and turn the TV right back off again. So every time they try to turn the TV on, as long as this do dishes input Boolean is turned on, it's just going to turn the TV right back off again. But of course, we do want a way to turn that input Boolean back off when the dishes are loaded. So again, we could have some kind of sensor on the dishwasher door or however else you want to be able to trigger, or again, mom or dad have the ability to go in and click that button and turn it back off themselves when they know that the dishes have been done or the dishwasher is loaded. And we simply turn that input Boolean back off again. Now you can turn the TV back on and it will stay on because the dishes have been done. Now I know this is by no means foolproof and there are probably ways that your kids will find to work around it. So again, there's lots of flexibility, a lot of other ways to do this, but maybe that'll give you some idea of how you can create virtual switches to use in your own Home Assistant environment and get really fancy with things like automations and launching scenes or anything else you want with a simple click of a button or slide of a toggle. So if you saw anything in this video that you liked, do me a favor and hit that thumbs up button. If you'd like to see more of my content, click that subscribe button and ding that little bell icon if you want to be notified when I release new videos. Now for some of my normal viewers, and if you actually hung around at the end of this video, I just want to let you know that I normally release every 2 weeks. That may be moved around just a bit over the next few weeks, as I actually am going to try to take a little bit of a vacation, but I'll still try to get some content out on a regular basis. So as always, I would like to say thank you for watching, and I hope to see you soon.